I think Jason said it best. What good is all this if you can't measure, monitor, analyze, react? Right, Aaron? So I'm pleased to have our sponsor for this event. So can we give him a big round of applause? Thank you. Yeah. All of the beer, all of the food. Thank you. Senior Vice President of Field Operations, fresh out of ElasticCon, right?
Yep.
And you're going to tell us about Elastic.
Thanks, Angel.
Thank you.
Very good. Okay, so I predict that this presentation will be in the top third of this afternoon's. So time to put down your phones. I don't think, though, it'll be the top presentation because I thought Sam's presentation, the CEO of the Cloud Foundry Foundation, was very good. But there was one comment that he made that I found a little suspicious, and it was, startups are easy. Does anybody else here work for a startup? Did you have the same reaction to that comment? No, startups are easy? I don't know if Sam's still in the room. It was a great presentation, but I've been at this startup for 2 years, and prior to that I spent 12 years at Salesforce.com, where I grew that from a small startup to the company that it is today. And I never thought I'd say this to 1,400 people, but drinks are on me tonight. So a quick poll.
Hold on. I think we need a much louder round of applause, please. Woo! Yeah! Aaron! Woo! Number one presentation. Done.
There you go. I don't know what number one, but hopefully the top third. So notwithstanding Jason McGee's reference to Elastic in his presentation or the placards on your table, who here has heard of Elasticsearch in their organization? All right, so that's probably about a third of the room, a third to a half of the room. Who here has got a project within their company that they know of that's using Elasticsearch today in some capacity? Great, okay. So who here in the last 24 hours has searched on Facebook or Wikipedia or used Uber? Those three sites in the last 24 hours, okay. So if I added Tinder to that list, how many more hands would go up? Because all of those sites are using Elasticsearch in one way or another. And so I thought the best way to spend the next 8 minutes would be to talk about some of those use cases. So this is a slide for the one person in the room who's not trying to do something with large amounts of data. Elasticsearch is a good technology for you guys to look for. But what we do is we enable companies and developers to analyze large data sets, whether it be structured, unstructured, semi-structured data, or geo information. And we do that in a variety of ways. And I'm going to talk about kind of the range of use cases that we're seeing in the field and that you guys are probably seeing within your own organizations. I mentioned some of the consumer internet companies that are using Elasticsearch, and we'll talk a little bit more about those. But if you kind of look at the spectrum of internal applications, which you're primarily focused on for internal consumption, versus those that you're building for your customers, we run the gamut. So let's start on the left-hand side, which is what we call logging and logging analytics, but essentially the analysis of time series data. So every time you touch your phone, every time you click on a link, it's spitting out oftentimes dozens of log files about who you are, where you are, what you're doing, and companies are analyzing that data for a variety of reasons. I think everybody knows that. And so a lot of people are using what we used to call the Elk Stack, which is Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana, to analyze this time series information. And companies that are using it, for example, are Goldman Sachs, Verizon. We'll talk a little bit about that. That's primarily focused on IT operations, application management, security analytics. In the middle is just a hodgepodge of analytics solutions that people are building on top of the Elk Stack, and we'll talk a bit about that. And then on the far right-hand side is search. And again, if you go on Wikipedia and search, you're using Elasticsearch. If you search on Facebook, Etsy, a variety of consumer internet sites, in fact, probably 9 out of 10 that have built a search feature in the last 12 months are most likely using Elasticsearch. In fact, if you search on GitHub for a line of code, you are searching Elasticsearch. When you take Uber to the conference in Las Vegas, Uber is sending information about your ride. Every 4 seconds, it's sending an event back to Elasticsearch, and they're using that information, obviously, for a variety of things to understand who their consumers and riders and drivers are and how to cater to them in different ways. So it's a very popular open source product. Elasticsearch. We just had our user conference last week, and Jason McGee, who you heard speak, keynoted our conference last week and talked about actually how IBM's using Elasticsearch. And you saw one of the use cases in Bluemix, but it's also being used in the Watson Developer Cloud. It's being used within Bluemix Search for Twitter. This is an interesting use case. You can search on 2 years' history of Twitter feeds using Elasticsearch on Bluemix, and it's also reconciling all of that information so that if an individual Twitter user deletes their account, deletes a post, all of those actions are being replicated in Elasticsearch. So you can kind of get your sense around the vast volumes of data that can be stored in Elasticsearch in a variety of use cases. So let's dig into those in a little more detail. The first is I talked about WikiMedia. So as you start thinking about how do you service your customers, how do you service your users, how do you make a more enjoyable search experience, how do you provide the relevant results that your users are looking for, how do you do that in hundreds of milliseconds, not seconds, but then how do you provide that same experience to your end customers internally within your organization to search on the data that sits within your own firewall. And again, we talked about WikiMedia, billions of real-time full-text searches every day in Elasticsearch. Mozilla, so I'm sure this week a lot of people are going to be talking about security. People are using Elasticsearch, Mozilla for example, to search 300 million events per day in what we call the security incident and event management space, or the SIM category. Verizon is using it in a B2B context to index more than 500 billion documents for real-time logging and analytics within their call center. Goldman Sachs. So Goldman Sachs perceived to be one of the more forward-thinking IT firms on Wall Street. A third of the 30,000 employees at Goldman Sachs are developers, either data scientists, architects, or engineers. A third, and the Wall Street average is 5 to 10% for an investment bank is in IT. A third of Goldman Sachs' employees are defined as a data scientist, an engineer, or developer. And their head of technology, Duet, who keynoted our conference last year, has talked about how Elasticsearch is one of the top 5 technologies they're building the future of the bank on in a variety of very interesting use cases. Facebook, if you search on Facebook, they process 60 million queries a day in a variety of different use cases. And they're also using our security plugins. So we've got a very rich open source distribution, and we also have what we call plugins. So we've got a plugin for security. If you needed role-based access control, audit logging, SSL encryption, document and field level security. We've got a plugin for alerting in the logging use case. So credit card processors are using it for anomaly detection or fraud detection, and they need to be notified when something occurs. So if somebody steals your credit card and swipes it in 3 different locations, a bunch of events occur. We have a plugin. So if you're using our open source, you can look at our Watcher plugin. And there's a tool called Marvel for monitoring and management. NASA, this is one of the most interesting use cases, and it came to light when I watched the movie Martian. Has anybody watched this recent movie with Matt Damon, Martian? It's a pretty cool movie. It's kind of resurfaces the MacGyver fan in me growing up, and where he had to survive on Mars. But the reality is that's happening today. The Mars rover is sending back 30,000 messages and 100,000 documents 4 times every single day into Elasticsearch. And for those of you that watch the movie, you can appreciate how that transport of data must occur. But the Jet Propulsion Labs down in Southern California, as part of NASA, is doing some very innovative things on Elasticsearch. So you can start to think about kind of the art of the possible when you consider this open source technology. So these numbers are a little outdated. We've had 50 million unique product downloads. So one of the more popular open source projects in the market today. 35,000 open source product commitments, and then 15,000 customers, and we talked a little bit about that. So I'm going to end there. I want to thank IBM for their partnership, and I'm happy to be here. So enjoy the conference.